So if you can't see them from where you are, come and take a seat down the front.
Good morning. Advent is the season leading up to the celebration of Christ's birth. As part of Advent season, we have had a practice of lighting candles. These candles are not magical. They are just reminders, things to help us ponder, explore and prepare our hearts and minds in the lead up to Christmas. As we come to the first candle, the candle of hope, we recognise this has been a difficult and strange year. We lament missed opportunities and even lost loved ones. We have often felt hopeless and lacking control. We look for hope, but our hope is not to be found in new normals, health department guidelines, or even super vaccines. Lighting this candle of hope, we acknowledge that our hope comes from God.
In this season of Advent, reminds us that down through the ages, God's people longed and hoped for God's promised Messiah. The candle of hope reminds us that God fulfilled his promise of a Redeemer, a Saviour, when he sent his Son Jesus, which is good news. It also reminds us that this story isn't finished. The candle of hope reminds us that this longed for good news is for the nations, not just us. It reminds us that many people will come and listen, and as we live in hope, following Jesus in our day-to-day lives, God will draw them to himself just as he promised.
Sorry, we had a video to show it's not working, is that right? Yeah. Ah, what a bummer. I just have to say, we have had some creative people in our community who are sort of bent in the dramatics, do some wonderful videos for Christmas. So they're not working, but we're going to put those up online so that you can watch later today. I think we're going to have a Q&A now with Abe and Reverend Melinda.
Yeah, sorry about that. Technical difficulties always stem from being in a new place each week, but we appreciate everyone coming out here. Yeah, I want to invite Melinda to the stage for a bit of a Q&A. Yeah, you can warmly welcome her. Also, welcome to everybody who is watching online. I know we have quite a few, so hello. I'm also behind the desk, so if you get a reply from me, it's me. So first of all, Melinda, who are you?
Who am I? That's such a, is that an existential question? No, my name's Melinda Cousins. Oh gosh, what do I say about myself? I'm a pastor. I'm currently at Baptist Churches of South Australia in the role of ministry accreditation, so training our pastors, and I'm also on the team at Richmond Baptist, so they're meeting online today. But yeah, it's great to be with you guys in the flesh.
Yeah, all right. Let's get the silly stuff out of the way. What's your ideal day? So you've got a day off from work.
Right.
What are you doing on that day?
Oh gosh, trying to fit in a lot of things, I think. My ideal day would be like, lots and lots of catching up with friends, I think. Not for coffee, unfortunately, I'm not a coffee drinker, but I'm happy for other people to drink coffee with me. But I think catching up with friends, probably going for a nice walk. I've become more appreciative of the beauty of God's creation, I think, the older I get. So going for a walk somewhere with lots of nice, flowers or trees or beach or that kind of thing. And then maybe curling up with a good book at night, depending on the weather. How's that?
Sounds like a pretty good day. Anybody resonate with that? Yeah. So hopefully this won't touch on too much of what you're speaking about, but could you give us like a Cliff Notes version of how you came to faith or your journey?
Sure, yeah. So I became a Christian as a teenager, basically through the influence of my best friend at high school. So her dad was a youth pastor. She invited me along to youth group and to church, and I got to know Jesus through their family and through the church. And made a commitment to follow Jesus when I was 15, was baptised, not having a clue at that point what that would lead to, but just trusting that I would give my whole life to Jesus and see where he took me. And he's taken me in different places. I came to Adelaide to study at university, so I grew up in New South Wales, And while I was studying at university, I got involved in a church who encouraged me in ministry, and I ended up becoming one of the pastors of that church, and here I am. That's the short version.
Yeah, no, that was very well done. So what do you do? It's a typical South Australian question. What's your I guess your job week to week? But also maybe in terms of what that role is, maybe for anybody who doesn't know, what possibly the organisation that you work for is.
Yes. Yeah. So my current role, which is about to change, but my current role, so Baptist Churches SA is kind of the movement or the association, the family of churches that we're a part of. So 75 different churches around SA and in the Northern Territory. And so I work as part of the team that is there to serve our churches, the things that we can do better together. So our local churches are on mission and ministry, making Jesus known in their local context. But there are some things that we can do better together. So our team includes people who do resourcing around really fun things like insurance and management of business practices, but we also have a team of people who think about helping churches with church planting or with next gen ministry. And my role in that team particularly is around, once churches have identified leaders that they want to take on a journey towards becoming pastors, we do a couple of years journeying with them of formation and training and educated so that they can be ordained and accredited with us, so you can have confidence in your leaders that they are leading you as people who are well trained, well equipped and well accountable.
Yeah. So I think most of us would potentially know of Mike Mills, who's been here a few times. So he's leaving his role. I guess what's the significance of what's coming up there?
Yes, so Mike has been in the role as our, what has been called State Executive Minister for 12 years, and he's finishing up. And so the role's had a title change, but it's now called Director of Ministries. And so at our assembly, which is kind of like the members meeting of our whole movement, so we're all representatives from all our churches gathered together. About 3 weeks ago, I was appointed as the new Director of Ministry, so I'll start that role in February next year.
Yeah, so she's the big boss. I also want to just highlight, this is the first female appointment across the country, so that's a fantastic win for us.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we're really privileged to have you here, talking to us today. I'm sure we'll find out a bit more about you when you speak.
Excellent.
But we'll get into another song. Before I do that, let me pray for you. So can we all assume the position? Dear God, I thank you for just the blessing that it is to have Mel here. Thank you for her journey with you and just where you've brought her, particularly in pastoral ministry and what she'll be moving into in the future, God. I pray that, whatever you put on her heart today, you'd be able to open our hearts to hear that message as well. That we, our ears would be open, we'd be willing to be molded by just that word. So we thank you for her, pray for her in your heavenly name. Amen. Amen. All right, back to the worship team.
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me. It's great to be with you this morning. Thanks, Mike, although he's not here, but for the invitation to join you and to kick off this Advent series where I believe over the next 4 weeks we're going to be sitting in the book of Jeremiah, which might seem like a strange choice for Advent, not Matthew or Luke or the gospel stories of Jesus' birth, but the prophet Jeremiah. And this series is one that came out of some messages that Elliot Keane, who's other pastor at Richmond Baptist with me, and I did at our pastors' conference earlier this year. And we looked at some of the key themes throughout the prophet Jeremiah. And Mike came to me afterwards and he said, I feel like those themes really resonate well with Advent. And I had never made that connection. I thought, I think you're right. I think there's something in that. Because Advent is really a season of preparation and expectation. Advent is the lead up to the coming of the Messiah. So for us, it's the lead up to Christmas. But really what Advent is a time of longing and expecting and preparing and waiting and readying ourselves for God to come and meet us. And so the season of Advent often draws heavily from the prophets, because the prophets were the people in the Old Testament who helped people name their expectation and longing and hope for God to come and meet them where they were at. So Advent for us today and around the church for the last few thousand years is not just about longing for Christmas, although we're expecting and longing for and building up to this great day of celebration where we remember Jesus' birth. but it's longing for God to come and meet us in the birth of his Son, in the coming of his Spirit, in the activity of his Spirit in our lives every day, and longing for Jesus to return and set all things right. And I wonder whether this year, more than many others for a lot of us, Advent has a real resonance of sitting in the longing. Because if we are longing and expecting and waiting for God to step in and set things right, we have to acknowledge that things are not right now. That things are not all as they should be. That all is not well in our world. And we've been reminded of that this year in particular. And so Advent is a time of acknowledging and naming our need for God to step in and meet us where we are. And so over the next few weeks, looking at Jeremiah's story and these key themes of his book, I hope that there'll be a journey that you're taken on, a journey that the prophets often took the people of God on, and a journey that Advent leads us through, which is from lament, which is where we're going to start today, through confession to find peace and hope. And so for Jeremiah, we're going to start with this idea of lament, which again might seem like a very strange way to start Advent. But it has been, certainly for the church around the world throughout history, particularly those in the church who've experienced great suffering, a key activity in Advent is lamenting. We're going to unpack what lament is, but at its heart, lamenting is acknowledging and naming before God our longing and our sense that things are not as they should be and that we long for God to step in. So, if we're going to unpack the book of Jeremiah, I need to take you back to the year 587 BC. And this was the year when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed by them.
He actually begins over with a statement of trust. And this is one of the fascinating things about lament. Lament might seem like an act of doubt, to question and cry out and rail against God and to name the darkness and the brokenness, but it's actually an act of trust. You see, to doubt God and to not have faith in him would involve not bringing our concerns to him. The one thing that God says throughout the Psalms in particular that he doesn't want is people who turn away from him in hard times. God can take our questions, he can take our doubts, he can take our fears, he can take our anger. But he wants us to bring it to him. And so the laments give us permission in an act of trust to bring to God whatever we are feeling. And so he acknowledges God as the one to whom he should rightly bring his complaint, his sorrow, his suffering. He starts by calling God the comforter in sorrow. Now, let me tell you, there are plenty of other names Jeremiah calls God throughout his laments, not quite so complimentary, many of them. But all his accusations, all his complaints are built on a foundation of trust. Wow. Lament is not an act of unfaith. It is a bold declaration of faith that we have a God who is willing to take whatever we have to throw at him. And I know this last year in particular, I've been writing a bit about lament, particularly from the Psalms, and it's been interesting how many people have said they found this a helpful practice in this season. But it's no surprise because it's been a practice that those who have experienced deep suffering have found helpful for many generations. But then Jeremiah moves on to an expression of how he feels. His heart is faint within him. Now, this is not some mere superficial emotion. This is a deep-seated agony that is like that echoed throughout the Psalms. An admission of pain and sorrow to the very depths of his being. And that emotion and that acknowledgement of emotion gives rise to questions that express genuine rejection and abandonment. Jeremiah feels like God has abandoned him and his people. Has God left us, he said? Is God no longer on his throne? Those are the questions that the experience of exile provokes. And they echo down the ages on the lips of many as we experience suffering and sorrow. Where is God? When it hurts, we ask. Trusting in God doesn't make you immune from these kinds of emotions and questions. Being a Christian doesn't mean that you don't doubt God's presence when things get hard. We know this in our own lives and in our communities. Pretending that these feelings and questions are not there is not the answer. Bringing them to God is all we've got. And lament gives us permission to do so. At the same time, it does seem that Jeremiah is able to recognise the fragility of where God's people have put their hope. He acknowledges that they've been looking for meaning and purpose for life in things that can never satisfy. Their longing is only exacerbated by the realisation that the things they put their trust in do not last and cannot deliver. For them, it's foreign idols, statues, gods made of stone and wood that they have tried to cry out to and to bow down to and found hold no hope and no life. For us, perhaps it's our wealth, it's our security, it's our sense of self-preservation, ability to look after ourselves and independence. And I wonder how these last few months have exposed for us the fragility of the things of this world and the fragility of the things we often take for granted and assume are never going to change. If we put our trust in things that are not the eternal lasting life of our God, then we will be shaken. And lament invites us to acknowledge that reality and to come back to the place of trust in the one true God. But while in lament our vulnerabilities are exposed, it's not the time for judgment. Lament is not a place of condemnation. Even as Jeremiah names the sins of his people, he is gripped with horror as he feels the weight of the crushing burdens they are experiencing. And as a prophet of God, Jeremiah's lament is not for himself alone. As God's appointed leader, he fully identifies with the freight of their brokenness and their wounds. As God's people, we are invited to lament not just on our own behalf, but alongside our brothers and sisters, our neighbours, our world. What does our world do when its confidence in all the things that it thought would preserve and last forever has been shaken? Where do people turn? How do the people of God speak lament in a way that brings faith and trust in the true God into our situation? But as a prophet, Jeremiah in particular also speaks for God. And here and throughout his laments, and really the reason why I chose this particular lament is because we are given an insight into how God feels, how God responds. God weeps with his people. God mourns with them. Even as they cry out with longing for his healing, God bathes them in his tears. It is God's voice that says, "Oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears." The depth of emotion in Jeremiah's lament reflects the depth of God's love for his people. God's heart is with them and for them. God has committed himself to these people, and so he enters into their suffering. When they weep, he weeps. When they mourn, he mourns. I don't know if any of you are on Twitter, and there's a particular section of Twitter, kind of Christian Twitter as I like to call it. There was a bit of a controversial tweet by a pastor in America this week, and his tweet was something along the lines of, "This hasn't been a hard year for God." And I think he was trying to say something pious and spiritual, but actually, the truth is, if God's people are having a hard time, God is having a hard time. God identifies with his people and suffers with us. If we are weeping, he is weeping. If we are mourning, he is mourning. God feels with us and for us. There's a long tradition in sort of ancient theologians to talk about God's impassibility, as if God were some stoic, unmoving, unfeeling being. That's not the God of the Bible. It's not the God of the Old Testament. It's not the God of the prophets. It's not the God of Jeremiah. And it is most certainly not the God of Jesus Christ, who fully enters into our suffering and takes it upon himself. Jeremiah's laments reveal a God who is deeply compassionate, long-suffering, merciful and gracious, to the point that he not only hears the laments of his people, he laments with them. And so if God God himself is willing to lament with his people, then surely lament becomes a significant invitation for us. Will we enter into this space with him? Will we join God's people throughout history and around the world in practicing his presence even in the dark and difficult circumstances? Now, lament, it's a fairly simple practice. There's no elaborate rituals involved. It doesn't require any study or expertise. What it requires of us is a willingness to be vulnerable and a willingness to name what's really happening in here as we experience what is happening out there. To be willing to say out loud where we hurt and what we long for and what we need. And lament requires courage. It requires courage to believe in faith that God comes and sits with us in the darkness. And lament can take time because it challenges us not to rush too quickly to easy resolutions or solutions or answers. To not try and wrap things up in a neat bow. I was talking about this with a pastor in one of our churches this week, and she's had this idea of having all these beautifully wrapped Christmas presents tied up in these beautiful nice ribbons and nice bows at the front of their church, and they're just untying all the bows. Because our inclination, our temptation is to try and wrap everything up in a neat bow. And that's not how the world works. And it's certainly not how lament works. It requires a willingness to sit in the tension and the uncertainty and the unanswered questions. We need to be willing to return and return and return again to this sacred space, to the God who meets us in our deepest needs. But in the end, I think lament brings us to the foot of the cross. To the God who in King Jesus has once and for all entered into the sin and suffering and brokenness and darkness and mess of our world and taken it all upon himself and invites us to cry out to him and with him for ourselves, for one another, and for our world. And so I wanted to finish this morning simply by inviting you to join me in a prayer of lament. I'm going to lead you through some of these key ideas of lament and give you some space in the silence to name what it might be for you. It might be that there is plenty going on in your world, in your life, about which you feel pain and sorrow, about which you have questions and fears and doubts. And I invite you to bring that to God and allow him to weep with you in that lament. Or maybe you think, I don't know if I need to lament right now. Well, I want to invite you to sit with your brothers and sisters who are lamenting and to think of the pain and the suffering and the sorrow that you are aware of in this community, in your neighbourhood, and certainly in our world. Lament is a practice that we can use for ourselves, but it is a practice that we're invited to adopt on behalf of our world and invite God to step into the brokenness and hurt that they are experiencing. So would you please join me in prayer? God, our comforter in sorrow, we come to you in lament, as your people have done for generations. And we acknowledge before you the experiences we have been through of suffering and sorrow. We think of the darkness that we live with and that we see around us. God, we bring to you our feelings of distress and sorrow. We bring to you our doubts, our fears, our questions. And God, we even bring to you our anger, our frustration, our despair. All the things we feel when we take time to acknowledge the darkness within us, around us, and in our world. God, we recognise that too often we place our trust in the wrong things. We look for answers, for security, for resolution in things of this world that will not last. And we want to come again to you as the true living God who is willing to hear all our laments. We cry out to you, our God, to come. Meet us here. Sit with us in our sorrow. Weep with us in our weeping. Bear with us the burdens, the brokenness of our life. Meet us in the middle of where we are. And God, we cry out with longing for you to step in and set things right. And as we sit in this Advent season and we prepare to celebrate that moment when you did enter into our world once and for all, that you didn't come with overwhelming force and power, but you came to meet us right where we are at. You came as one of us, a vulnerable child, to walk with us. And Jesus, that gives us confidence that we don't have to figure everything out and resolve all our questions and remove all our doubts and wrap up all our suffering in order to know you. But we come to you just as we are and allow you to meet us and minister to us in you. Jesus, I thank you for this community, and I pray that over these coming weeks, as I sit with Jeremiah and journey through the challenge and the invitation of these practices of lament, confession, peace and hope, that you would be at work, that your people would find for themselves renewed and refreshed restoration and relationship in you, that as a community they would be drawn into what you are doing and saying, and that as a light to the world around them, that you would enable them to invite others to meet you in the middle of wherever they are at. In Jesus' name we pray.